Welcome to this month's webinar from iNPUT-ACE on balancing the needs between IT departments and video-related investigations. I have the pleasure today of having Lieutenant James Emerson on the line with me as well. I'll start by introducing myself. Jim will be turning over the side of the presentation speaking about the IT issues that are experienced when related to video evidence and video evidence use within an agency's networks. And I will be taking a look from the investigations perspective about how investigators are commonly working with video evidence to begin a conversation to help bridge the gap between two different conversations that are often being had within an agency that may not overlap. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Andrew Fredericks. I'm a certified forensic video analyst and the technical director for iNPUT-ACE. And I look forward to walking through step by step how video evidence is being used and how it might be affecting IT departments on the other side of this conversation. Lieutenant Emerson, can you please introduce yourself to the group?
Andrew, thank you. I'm a retired Marine officer who spent half of his career in law enforcement, along with a lot of technology background from the Department of Defense, which the last 15 years has translated into cybersecurity at the law enforcement level for the interest of state and local, as well as cybercrime investigation in an array of capacities, which you'll see there on screen.
Excellent. Thank you very much. The goal of this webinar, as I have briefly mentioned, is to begin a dialogue between IT departments and investigators who are working with video evidence. The two departments have very different goals than one another, and it is critical that the conversation is had between the two different departments so that not only can we begin to understand the challenges that the other side is dealing with within their daily work life as it relates to video evidence, but also to establish long-term solutions that can benefit both parties. We're going to be focusing primarily on three specific goals between the two different units. From the investigation side, the goal is to quickly and easily access video evidence. Video is the most prolific source of evidence available to law enforcement today. It is being recorded on practically every street corner. Many officers have body-worn systems. Many vehicles have in-car video systems, and the vast majority of civilians are recording video daily with their cell phones. It is a lot of data to work with. And the challenges that investigators encounter is that not all video files are made equal. Some video files, like those recorded by an iPhone or an Android phone, might be in a standard format that they can open up easily, but it is far more common that the body-worn systems, the in-car video systems, the CCTV surveillance systems on the street corners are recording into non-standard formats that can't be quickly accessed. It's a big challenge today. Even if it can be accessed and that data is now viewable on an investigator's computer, the next challenge, the next goal to overcome is getting that data into the courts. The courtroom computers may not have the same software installed that are on the investigation systems, and getting that data from the investigator's computer and in front of the jury is a significant challenge and goal. And then, of course, the last goal here is maintaining a forensically accurate workflow, getting access to the data in a forensically sound manner, ensuring that the data that is going in front of the courts has been forensically managed, and ensuring that opposing counsel, typically defense counsel, if we're talking from a department's perspective, is not going to be able to poke holes and ultimately get that data dismissed from being presented to the jury. So as I begin to turn this over to Jim to speak about the IT department side, keep in mind that the investigators want quick and easy access to the video. They need to convert it, getting it into the courts, and they need to ensure that it's forensically sound. So Lieutenant Emerson, can you please take over here? I'm going to turn this over to you for the next several slides.
Thank you, Andrew. Security is about the data, first and foremost. The confidentiality, the integrity, the ability to access the data is essentially what INFOSEC exists for, the purpose. In this particular case, we go back to 2002. We have the Federal Information Security Management Act, more recently the Federal Information Security Modernization Act. Those particular pieces of legislation drove the National Institute Standards and Technology to create security policy guidelines controls that affected federal data sources, data systems. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the CJIS division, has a security policy that essentially relates to data that state and local agencies consume, whether that's the III index or whether that is NCIC, IAFIS, UCR, NIBRS. That's criminal justice information, and there's a wide area networking compliance requirement to connect. It's the discussion about the weakest link in the chain. So it doesn't matter if we harden the front door, if we leave the back window open, and the wide area networking compliance issue is about connecting. The second issue is inside the agency. The local area networking compliance issue has a lot to do with the demographic of the agency, the workflow, the types of technology that are in play. And as Andrew's already pointed to, that's expanding rapidly. I mean, we're adding technology day in and day out, shot spotting systems, for example, depending on how they connect within an agency's network, their enterprise, they have an impact on the rest of that enterprise. And then finally, there is the issue of the endpoint. In this day and age, the endpoint or the device, the laptop, the mobile device, the tablet, is increasingly capable. I mean, the processing power in my mobile phone is greater now than it used to be for a server that we may have run, within the defense establishment years ago. So the ability to diversify the code that's running on those endpoints and to do a lot of things within that local area network makes the endpoint a very viable concern with regard to security, as it might impact criminal justice information. So talking a little bit more deeply about the wide area networking compliance focus, we're connecting to the federal network, whether it's through the state, in some capacity. The largest issue for discussion is typically encryption, and whether the encryption of that connection is compliant with the FIPS standard and ultimately the FISMA requirement, so that it meets the controls that have been designated as effective, in current generation. Access and authentication, once you've got an encrypted tunnel, the ability to allow somebody to access a device on one side or the other, or make connections between different processing points or points of presence, is another matter of strict concern, because again, it's opening that back window if it's not done properly. Now, ultimately, this is about the data. As I said earlier, criminal justice information data deserves segmentation. Far too often, we run into compliance issues when there's not adequate segmentation. So the more that we can actually move criminal justice information to a segmented environment, the more simple and one or two dimensional protecting that data, the authentication at that point becomes. And to do that, in a lot of cases, the organization, the design of the organization, how people in the organization conduct their work. I mean, a mobile data terminal is greatly different than a laptop or a desktop inside of a SCIF or a secure, physically protected environment. Physical security is obviously a point of economy, but it's not practical in a lot of agencies. It just doesn't work out that way. We've got, deputies, officers that are out on the street that need access to that criminal justice information, regardless of where they are, what the circumstances are, and the point in time this is all needed. So continuous monitoring then becomes necessary, and the ability to look at the organization both externally and internally as it relates to integrity benefits from an organization's ability to monitor continuously. Problem there is that in a lot of cases, a state or a local agency may not actually own the process. It might belong to the town, the county, the state at some greater or higher level. So understanding how that's going to impact how the agency operates is significant. The second goal is essentially that local area network. I think it's important to understand that if I network my refrigerator inside of my house, the refrigerator just like if I add laptops with diverse purposes inside of a police department, they have an impact on everything else that's on that network, depending on the controls that I put in place, the ability to segment certain parts of that network, certain devices on that network, whether it's logically or physically. It becomes incredibly important to understand the fact that there's something running on those devices which can have an impact on data that I think is critical, that I've given a classification to, and that I seek to protect. Access and authentication, not only of humans, but also of those devices and how they connect to the network, the permissions they have on the network become part and parcel to that discussion. The ability to take data that's not in use, that's not under human or process supervised control at any given point, and encrypt it while it's static, while it's in motion, while it's somewhere out of supervised memory, is a critical point to providing that confidentiality and integrity that I mentioned earlier. And again, the topology of the network and how we actually provide network access to various offices, various divisions of an agency, how we allow a particular type of device to join the network, the diversity of the nodes, whether they're an agency allows officers, deputies to bring their own devices, how much mobile computing capacity is actually in a handheld device. Again, as we diminish physical security, we need to enhance and increase logical security safeguards. And that's where we get into this concept of layering security controls to compensate for deficiencies in other more traditional ways. The third goal is the endpoint. And as I mentioned earlier, the computing capacity in a mobile device nowadays is tremendous. If I'm going to use that mobile device to access criminal justice information, it has to be done in a way that I can provide the same ideal standard of integrity and safeguarding for that data as I would if I were, again, sitting at a desktop computer inside of a SCIF. I mean, that's ultimately the goal. We may express it in other terms, but that's essentially what we're trying to do here. So how those other devices access and authenticate the local area network, there's a parallel here at the endpoint. What other applications are actually in play and being used? What other binaries are in memory? What's happening there? What's the exposure to other data on other systems that's created by this one particular device and applications that are running in that device environment in memory? Encryption again becomes key, but from the standpoint of encryption, we may take some diverse approaches. It may well be that we can firewall at the application layer. We may be able to whitelist and deny connections other than for specific, in essence, creating service networks that become very exacting and deny all other functionality that might emanate from that device that's not, it's the square peg, trying to fit the round hole. Again, there are a whole host of security controls, whether it's human, whether it happens to be personnel or physical related considerations. Everything starts with definition of the use case. Obviously, video forensic tools, players, the ability to view evidence, have a legitimate criminal justice purpose, investigative purpose, and they need to be managed in accordance with and in balance with the ability to protect other criminal justice information that we benefit from the federal level or the state level. Again, physical security, if it's not optimal, if it's not one-dimensional, it rarely ever is, needs to be compensated in other ways with other logical safeguards that give us the ability to reduce risk. So at this point, I'm going to pass it back to Andrew to kind of put this back in the perspective of the video forensic discussion and the various tools.
Thank you very much. So as Lieutenant Emerson is discussing here, the IT departments have a lot of balls that they are juggling, and their concern is the security of their network and to keep operations intact. And investigators who are working with video evidence are going to be limited based on the IT departments who are focused on that primary goal. But investigators have a slightly different set of goals. Their primary goals as it relates to video evidence is quickly accessing the video. If an event occurs, they need to see the video evidence as quickly as possible and take actionable information from that. Old methods of getting access to the video are quite time-consuming, and they involve looking for proprietary players on the internet, installing various codecs to try to get files to play, potentially maintaining player libraries offline on their own systems. And I'll be going through a process after the end of the overview of these three goals, showing what that would look like from a typical investigations perspective on a real case using those real techniques. And what we'll end with is this primary question. Is it accurate? Are those old methods accurate? Do they solve the goals of the investigator? Do they provide the quick access to the video? Are they able to be converted? And are they accurate? The second goal, of course, is the ability of providing the court-friendly file types. If a file is starting in a proprietary format that can't be played on the investigator's computer, if the investigator goes through a process of internet searching and finding proprietary players / codecs, if they get that data to play on their computer, what can they do to get that data into the courtrooms without losing any data or detail? For those who are not as familiar with this concept of proprietary formats versus standard formats, when I say standard formats, I'm commonly referring to formats like the AVI container, the MP4 container, or even nowadays the MKV container. When a file exists in that format with a standard codec, it will commonly be playable on a typical computer system. But as soon as we introduce proprietary codecs or proprietary formats, the ability of playing that data on courtroom computers or investigative systems is now not only challenging, but sometimes not possible. And finally, getting forensically accurate results. By maintaining the visual integrity of that evidence through our workflow of starting with proprietary video, getting that into the courtroom, displaying it for the jury, we need to ensure that we have validation tools to ensure that we're dealing with it correctly. We need to ensure that we're playing that original video for the jury. If I'm, as a forensic video analyst, working with video evidence on my computer system and then displaying something completely different to the jury, there's a significant loophole in there or a significant challenge in there that can ultimately lead to video getting dismissed if we're not careful. Done either through Daubert and Frye challenges to the video evidence or simply chain of custody issues and admissibility issues that relate from that. And in a more general terms, I need to have confidence in testifying. Regardless of whether or not I'm talking about this from a forensic video analyst's perspective or talking about this from a general major crimes investigator who's working with video, we need to have confidence that when we're testifying to the video evidence and interpreting that video evidence and potentially making opinions from that evidence, that we have confidence in doing so. We're going to transition very quickly now into a bit of a hands-on walkthrough of a couple of common scenarios that can be encountered within the world of investigations. Starting with an example of what a proprietary codec looks like. Here I have a .mpeg video file that has been pulled from a surveillance system in a major crimes investigation. When an investigator recovers a file like this, the tendency typically, regardless of the level of training, is to try to open this with a standard player. For example, by double-clicking on this and trying to open this with Windows Media Player. And in this case, we're seeing immediately that Windows Media Player is encountering a problem with playing the file. Now, more specifically, what's occurring here is that this particular file includes a proprietary codec that Windows Media Player does not have access to because it is not installed on this computer. So a codec, I know we've been using this term. I'm expecting that most people are familiar with what that term means. For those of you who are not, a codec stands for coder, decoder, or encoder, decoder, and it refers to a physical file on the computer that works to read video data. So essentially it works like the language to read a video file, in the same way that my mind might work in the English language to decode a book by reading through the letters of that book and getting meaning from that book. A codec works to read through a video file and end up interpreting that video file to become pictures. And in the same way that that analogy holds true, where if my mind works within the English language, were to pick up a Japanese book and try to read through the characters, I wouldn't be able to get any meaningful information from that. I would be reading what essentially would be gibberish. And if you use a incorrect codec to read through video data, you'll experience the same process. The player will end up returning a set of images that may not be the accurate information or may be completely meaningless. And in this case, it's simply outright failing. Windows Media Player cannot grab the codec to play this file, so it stops. Now, with this particular case, we've also received a proprietary codec installer. Now, again, typical investigation process is going to be to try to install this codec without even thinking twice about the potential IT impact that might have on the network or on the individual end user's computer. So by double-clicking on this file and running it, if there are administrative rights on the computer to even do so, now when I go back and double-click on the proprietary player, it's now launching open and playing this file within Windows Media Player. So from an investigator's perspective who's not concerned with the CGIS requirements or concerned with potential issues that can impact the network on from the IT side of things, we've now solved that first goal of getting access to this video as quickly as possible when we have a proprietary codec to use if we have the ability of having administrative rights. And so oftentimes investigators can have frustrations with IT departments who are blocking the installation of codecs because from an IT side, they have different goals than the investigator's intent to play this back quickly. So why might an IT department want to block this from happening on the end user's computer? Well, let's take a quick dive into what this proprietary codec installer actually includes. And I'm going to use a tool here that will allow me to see what is inside of this exe file. And when I drag it in, we can see that it includes a number of different DLLs and .ax files for different codecs and registry keys that will alter the end user's computer. By installing the DLLs, which we can see here, the data that makes up those DLLs, and even going through and altering the registry keys for some of the standard codecs that are on the computer. So the xvid set of registry keys, by running this installer, we've modified them and changed the default settings for those registry keys, which again can have some serious impacts on the end user's computer. If anyone attending this webinar has had the experience of altering registry keys inadvertently and then trying to go back and repair them, it is faster to simply reinstall Windows. It can corrupt the computer in a way that causes all video files that are trying to go down a path of accessing this data to be not only challenging, but sometimes not usable in the slightest. So once I've double-clicked and run that exe, we can see here inside of our registry, what I'm going to do very quickly is load up another tool that will allow me to visualize the path that this file is going down to see where that data is being installed to. By leveraging iNPUT-ACE very quickly, which we'll come back to later on in the webinar, I'm going to go into a graphical view that shows how the proprietary file is being identified as an AVI container, parsing out that the codec being used is the N264 codec, and ultimately leading to rendering on screen. And I'm simply using this to snap myself to the file location where that codec is coming from within Windows. And we can see that at this date, at roughly 10:22, which was a couple minutes ago, every single one of these files was installed into this particular directory, automatically overwriting any other file that has the same name, also automatically adjusting any registry keys that are going to be used to pull these files from the registry. And we've done that all automatically by simply double-clicking and running the installer here without knowing necessarily what was going on. So of course, if I go back and I delete these files out of the program and I try to rerun this file, Windows Media Player is going to come back with a failure saying it can't access the file. Another example here is when we're dealing with proprietary formats, like in this case, a .drv format. Unlike the last example where we can simply double-click on this and try to open this with Windows Media Player, we're going to run into an issue where Windows Media Player cannot handle this file format no matter what we try to do. And there's no proprietary codec installer that we can use to get Windows Media Player or other standard players to read this file. So typically within an investigation perspective, the next step is going to be trying to find a proprietary player in the case. Now I've included that proprietary player here myself automatically after going through a searching process, but let's take a quick step back and watch what a typical investigator is going to do when encountering a file like that. The common thing is to use a search engine like Google to search for a .drv video player, and then begin browsing through any of the links that come up. For example, here we have a thread from a Apple forum talking about running into a CCTV DRV file with recommendations like downloading Handbrake, which doesn't work, downloading other tools from Apple, which obviously didn't work, downloading an any video converter tool, which also in this case does not work, and going through a bunch of different installers and trial and error to see if we can get any of this to play, which none of those solutions are effective. We might then go through a few different forums trying to find different codecs, and may land ultimately here on another CCTV forum going through a similar process. And the first recommendation is to download a directive or a DirectX installer that, when clicked on, will automatically download an installer that's going to alter DirectX on the user's computer. Which I'm assuming anyone on the IT side of here is cringing at the thought of this occurring on an end user's computer. But this is the kind of thing that is happening daily from an investigation side. Individuals that have a little bit more training than this may know not to do these kinds of installations, but it is extremely common that investigators working with video evidence are going through forums like this because it's the first links that come back on Google and trying to perform the installations without thinking twice about what's going to affect the potential security on an end user's computer. If the investigator ultimately does find a proprietary player from the manufacturer that creates that file after the time that it takes to find that, this is the kind of issue that they'll run into at that point. Here we have a .exe file that launches open a Speco player to try to play back that DRV file. This is what we refer to as a proprietary video player. It's intended to play back those .drv files, but what we're going to talk about through the rest of this webinar is the challenges and issues that arise from using proprietary players and the potential forensic issues that can happen at trial when we rely solely on players like this. One of the first challenges that an investigator will run into with a proprietary player is figuring out how to get the data into the player in the first place. In this case, we have to identify the play button. Then we have to identify the drive letter to open, which there's no way to get to the desktop automatically, so I'd have to browse through my users directory to get to my desktop, to find my folder, to go into the folder and identify the proprietary format, which can be quite frustrating. Then we have to press the playback button and the OK button. So I've already gone through the trial and error to get to that point, but it can be quite time consuming to learn every individual player and how they might be different than others. And now what we're doing is playing the waiting game. I've pressed the load button. I'm not touching my mouse or my keyboard from now until the data loads, but it simply takes a long period of time for this data to be loaded by this particular proprietary player. And then once the data comes in, now we can have at least the ability of playing back the data, but we're very limited on the tools that we were provided. So for example, if I want to view camera 16 in more detail, I can double click and open this up to play this back in a larger view. But although I can play it, I don't have the ability of scrubbing forward in time to get to different areas, so I'm playing this back in real time right now. In the old way of handling this to get this data out of the program, we're stuck with the proprietary player as the sole playback engine. So what do we do to get this data into the courtrooms? Do we press the snapshot icon? Well, unfortunately, that only creates a single .jpeg image with a player interface around the image, which can be quite time-consuming to go frame by frame and extract out each image. And more importantly, the JPEG file format is a compressed file format that will alter and change the relationships of some of the pixels on the image. If we were to go through a screen capturing process by using a tool to screen record our data, not only is that quite time-consuming because we have to do that camera by camera by camera throughout each of the different potentially 16+ camera views, which will be very time-consuming. But in addition to that, if we look at the screen resolution of the playback here by using a measuring tool, the playback is displaying right now at 711 pixels by 509 pixels, which is an uncommon frame size, which means that this proprietary player is stretching the different shapes of objects and potentially changing the colors of different pixels, which again can have forensic implications when trying to use this data in trial if we're relying on this player to be the sole source for that evidence. So of course, this then begs the question, is there a better way, and is there a solution that handles both the needs of the IT departments and the needs of the investigators to get access to this data in as quick a way as possible while maintaining the integrity of the systems from an IT side? And this is where the iNPUT-ACE solution is the primary solution and the only solution in many cases to handle this kind of data. iNPUT-ACE is a self-contained installer, meaning that there are no registry keys being affected on a codec level when running the installer. We include the installation for iNPUT-ACE in a simple zip installer, which means that when an investigator downloads iNPUT-ACE, all they're doing is unzipping a self-contained folder that runs everything natively inside of that folder, which doesn't reach out to the rest of the network or affect any of the other end users' computers, and allows IT departments to more effectively manage the installations on the end user side. From an investigator's perspective, they now have the ability of taking files like this .drv file, dragging and dropping them into a very easy-to-use interface to then play back the video data and see each of the individual streams in a file automatically with tools to scrub back forward in time, tools to fast forward through the video, tools to tag images, create clips of video, view the data at its original pixel dimensions, in this case of 720 by 480, toggling between any other camera view that may be relevant in the case, and then having the tools to convert this data out into any other standardized format. So going away from this DRV example, let's take a look at what that looks like on a more comprehensive example. I'm going to simply delete this data out of my file list very quickly and look at a subset of data files, common different types of files that are encountered. Potentially, the types of files that can be counted are going to be in the hundreds, and here we have a cross-section of different types of proprietary video files. Extensions like .dat, .dav, .vam, .ssf, .irf, .exe potentially, any number of different types of proprietary files. When users running iNPUT-ACE now have the ability of dragging these files directly into the iNPUT-ACE interface, iNPUT-ACE then goes through and extracts out the raw video and audio from each of those different clips. The viewer can then play the video, scrubbing forward in time, zooming into the video with their mouse wheel, tracking activity of potentially suspicious suspects, pausing the video, using quick hotkeys to frame step and tag images, the ability of exporting still images in an uncompressed format, the ability of creating clips of video starting at an in mark and going to a potential out mark, and creating sections of video that can be processed to limit the amount of that is being played for a jury, enhancement tools, report writing tools, codec analysis tools, and much, much more in the program. We're not going to go into all of those additional bells and whistles in this webinar. We're focusing primarily on the ability of getting this data into the courtroom. And that's where the workflow tab within iNPUT-ACE allows users to quickly process this data into a standard format like MP4 without changing the data in any way, without changing the visual information, without affecting the picture values of any of the files in question. We can now set some very basic settings and convert every single one of these files all at once into a standard format like MP4 and get this data into the courtroom so that it can be played on a standard computer like Windows Media, like a standard player like Windows Media Player. So what I've just done very quickly is I've built a workflow within iNPUT-ACE to take all of these different files, process them to MP4 with some very basic settings, and this is going to run as soon as I press the execute workflow button down here in the bottom left-hand corner, or excuse me, bottom right-hand corner of my program. And just to highlight how quick this is, here's my output folder, and the workflow is now running. And in not more than a couple seconds, every single one of these files has been converted out to an MP4 format. Now we can simply double-click on this file and play it with Windows Media Player. We can play it within VLC, and we can very easily get access to this data into the courtrooms, whether we're dealing with single still images or clips of video that we need to present to the jury. So we've seen now how much more quickly investigators can get access to the evidence using iNPUT-ACE. We've seen how much more secure that approach is than the process of installing proprietary players constantly to systems that are connected to the agency's network. But what I'd like to end with is a quick highlight of a few of the different ways that proprietary players can negatively impact the forensic integrity of a video file. We've got about another 6 to 8 minutes before we're going to open this up to questions. So if you have any questions from anything that you've seen or heard about during this webinar, please begin to post those questions now, and we will have some time at the end of the webinar to address those, either from myself or from Lieutenant Emerson. So here I have 3 different examples of ways that proprietary players will change the essence of the video data in negative ways. We're going to start with an example of a .ave file and a player that plays those .ave files. And what you'll see here is as we play through this video data, we're able to see the video data, potentially extracting out still images by going through a right click and a save snapshot action. And then the data is also playable within iNPUT-ACE by simply dragging and dropping the file within iNPUT-ACE. And if we compare the exported versions of iNPUT-ACE to the proprietary player, here's the difference of what we'll see. This is the image from iNPUT-ACE from the first image of the file, and here's the image from the proprietary player. Noticing how much brighter the data is within the player and how much less detail we're seeing inside of the image. If we zoom into an area like the top right-hand corner of the image, for example, take a look at the detail that we're seeing in this region within the images that are extracted using the raw data from within iNPUT-ACE, compared to the data that we're getting from a proprietary player that completely washes out that data and stretching the colors that are available in the image. And that data, once it's been extracted in this manner, is not able to be recovered. Once that data is gone, we've lost it. So if we're starting by using the proprietary player and not iNPUT-ACE like we're seeing here, we're going to lose that information and never get it back. And this is one example from one kind of proprietary player that happens to work in this manner. Another example that we'll see here is on a .exe format. When we launch open and play this .exe format, we can see the video, we can expand the video, and we can even go through and save out images or potentially clips of video. However, what may not be visible by first glance is that this player is arbitrarily stretching and adding in 2 rows of pixels across the image, which we can see barely visibly here as we view it full screen, become much more visible when we view the side-by-side from the data that we're getting from iNPUT-ACE. This is the raw bitmap image extracted from within iNPUT-ACE. And this is the way that the proprietary player sees it. And as I go back and forth between these 2 images, you'll notice that the data is getting stretched arbitrarily across a line of video right here, and again stretched vertically across a line right here. So we can see how impactful this can be when doing things like potentially speed calculations of vehicles that are driving through the area. By stretching the pixels, we've adjusted and altered the ability of measuring that data. Or looking at facial recognition and seeing what would happen when a line of video that goes across the image is in the area of someone's face, we'll see pixels that are stretched arbitrarily that adjust the shapes of the way that their face appears. And of course, this data can lead to ultimate challenges when presenting this at trial, when the data that we're dealing with is not being displayed accurately by the end user. Versus the option of taking that data, the original EXE, dragging that data into the iNPUT-ACE file list, letting iNPUT-ACE interrogate that video and expand it to revealing its different streams, and extracting out the timestamp, providing us with all the other tools that we've talked about, and ensuring that we're dealing with the raw data at the raw pixel level. One final example that I'd like to show is an example of how many different players handle what's called deinterlacing. And we've covered this in past webinars, so I'm going to highlight the practical scenario that is impacted by this. But here we have an example of a particular proprietary player statically viewing the image at 590 by 417 pixels. Now, the original image was actually captured at 720 by 480. So here we can see not only how much additional detail we have in the image, but how the shapes were when they were captured by the DVR. Now, not getting into any aspect ratio topics here, we've got another webinar that goes into much more detail about that. We can at least take a look quickly at how the proprietary player is going to be scaling the image and altering it from what was originally recorded in a way that the user has no control over. But more importantly than that, this particular proprietary player deletes every single other image of video in the file. So whereas looking at the embedded images extracted from iNPUT-ACE, we can see an image update every single time that I frame advance here. The proprietary player has deleted every single other image from the file, and investigators relying on this proprietary player and relying only on this proprietary player have now essentially deleted half of the available evidence from the file and are presenting half of the available evidence to the jury, and arguably, from opposing counsel's perspective, have removed that data from the video and will potentially lead to significant challenges that are difficult to get past from an investigator's perspective who is testifying to this evidence. So taking a quick glance back at our original recapping here of the primary goals that are being encountered from both the IT perspective and from the investigation's perspective. We have three primary goals. Investigators have the primary goals of quickly and easily accessing the video evidence, easily converting that data into the courtroom so that it can be played on the courtroom computers, ensuring that it's forensically accurate. And the iNPUT-ACE solution is built for investigators to get those solutions as quickly and easily as possible. While on the other side, IT departments who are going to be working with investigators to assist in the investigation's goal have a different goal. And their primary goal is all related to CJIS issues, like ensuring that the network's security is intact from both the local area network and the wide area network, and that they're complying with various standards and procedures that are in place. If anything goes wrong on an agency's system, the IT department is the one that typically is getting the blame, whether it's their fault or not. And so their concerns are much more heavily weighted towards ensuring that the network doesn't go down and that malware and bloatware and other potential security issues are not affecting the network, whereas the investigators are more likely to want to install proprietary players as quickly as possible to get access to the video. So I hope that this helps to understand whether you're an investigator attending this webinar to see the reasons why your IT department may be working in the way they're working. And I hope that from an IT perspective, you can see why the investigators may be frustrated at times with the ability of getting access to their video evidence, because they need to get access to that data as quickly as possible. And I hope that you can see the way that the iNPUT-ACE solution helps to bridge that gap between the two different departments. And I hope that you at least learned something through this webinar, and we're going to open this up to questions to begin the question and answer phase of this webinar. So while the questions come in, we've got a comment that came in from one of the attendees that I think is an interesting point. This is from an investigations perspective about a rule that was just implemented by their IT department that is causing some challenges. And I think that it highlights this exact goal that we're having here of bridging the gap between those two different departments. In this particular case, the IT departments ended up rolling out a new standard procedure that is requiring all end users that have access to the local area network to use encrypted thumb drives for anything that is being plugged into the network connected systems, which from an IT perspective makes a lot of sense. It's a very secure process. It will help to keep external files off the network that are not secured, and it helps to ensure that other individuals cannot access the local area network in a maliciously intentful way. But the problems that are being encountered on the investigation side is when using those thumb drives to plug them into a DVR system to extract out video data from a DVR system, when using the encrypted file systems, the DVRs don't understand them and they cannot be used to extract out the files from the DVR. Commonly within DVR systems, the DVRs require FAT32 formatted devices. So the encrypted systems, although they're great for connecting to the local area network, can't be used to extract out the video from the DVRs, which now causes a significant challenge for the end users who have to use systems that are disconnected from the network in order to get access to that data before transferring it to the network. So causing, again, significant issues in that first point that investigators have of wanting quick and easy access to the video. Decisions made by IT can sometimes impact that, but for good reasons. So I'm hoping that this can help bridge that gap between the conversations that are had from both sides. Okay, Jim, I've got a question coming in for you here about any architectural solutions that handle some of the IT issues on the networking side. So can you address that question? It again relates to any of the more architectural level solutions on the networking side to handle some of these issues that we've been talking about.
There's a whole range of options available, and frankly, the bottom line tends to be the agency's ability to bear cost and willingness to spend against some of the solutions. But keep in mind, originally I mentioned, that segmenting the criminal justice information, that data, the environment that has access and permission, to access that data, if you can break this particular workflow out into a separate environment, whether it's a single system that has a dedicated point of presence, from the perspective of undercover online investigations, that's pretty common. The problem with that solution tends to be, in all honesty, that you're going to have more than one investigator, more than one examiner on that particular bench. And as you pointed out in the beginning of your comments, Andrew, the system tends to get cluttered. There's a potential, chaotic, chaos cutting through the workflow of multiple people. And after a while, sometimes those particular platforms can become dysfunctional if they're not maintained with a view towards the various users. So the more users, the option there would be to virtualize on a more capable system that had sufficient memory and give multiple people remote access, segmented access into that virtualized system. So while you've not segmented the criminal justice information, you've segmented this exceptional workflow to another small local area network. There would be virtualization and partitioning options available to break up the multi-user environment, kind of defeat that one station set of problems, or at least mitigate them a bit. Whether it's a remote desktop access environment, or whether it is some other controlled connection to that particular either network or maybe a robust server that's been virtualized for multiple users. That would represent some topology options, to try to address the issue. I think that the network point of presence issue is the high end of the discussion, and in many cases, either you find a way to normalize this particular use of these binaries in that environment, which seems to be difficult and ever changing, as you've already pointed out, or you find a separate point of presence to address the work.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I have another question that's come in here about what is the pricing of iNPUT-ACE. I'll leave that to redirect that question to contact our sales team at sales@inputace.com. But as a more general answer to that question, we have several licensing options that assist in an agency to outfit their investigation units with the tools to quickly and easily access their video while maintaining all of the IT issues as we've talked about. And that's referred to as our seat licenses, which allow investigation units from major crimes divisions through forensic video analysis units access to concurrently running licenses of the iNPUT-ACE software solution. Again, all working off of those standardized zip uninstallers to run the software so that it's not touching the network and not reaching out to the network for its licensing, but rather looking to a quick communication out to the web to grab a license. So although it is not running on the web, it is not running on the end user's network, it simply makes a communication out to see if a license is available. And based on the package size of the concurrently running number of licenses, the iNPUT-ACE software will simply launch and work on the end user's computer. which is a very effective way to assist investigators who are working with video evidence to transfer that video evidence over to a potential prosecutor who might be working on the case, transferring that data over to a video analysis unit. So one of the very common setups that exists within the investigations to the forensic video analysis side is for an investigator to begin the work of playing back the video data, tracking and looking for their potential suspect in a case. And once that data has been identified and tagged within iNPUT-ACE, that data can be sent to a video lab to open that data up and continue the work from a video analysis perspective. So I'll leave the question of pricing to the sales individuals within the organization to talk about that. But I hope that at least expands on the different licensing options that exist, from both the full-featured seat license, as I described, to a standard USB dongle license that can exist individually on the end user's computer and activate that one single system. So I'd like to come to a close here. We wanted to keep this webinar under an hour, and we're running up right close to that amount of time. So thank you again, everyone, for attending this webinar. I hope that this has been enlightening, both from the investigation side and from the IT side. And I'd like to thank Lieutenant Emerson for joining us here. And if anyone would like to reach out in regards to getting training as an investigator, or getting training as a forensic video analyst, our agency, our organization provides training both to investigators to provide surface level training, understanding about the challenges with video evidence and some of the issues that come with them, through to the more deep video analysis training that we provide on the software solution itself. So if you're interested in training or in software, please reach out to us. Our website, again, is www.inputace.com. That's INPUT-ACE.com, where we can help with that. And again, thank you very much, Lieutenant Emerson, for joining me. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And I look forward to speaking with you on our next webinar.